time matters. Time is inescapable. And that the same diet that works incredibly well at one point in time can be detrimental at another point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And the variable is time. And once you get your arms around this, it changes the entire landscape, because all of a sudden the question is, at what point in time becomes the most important question. And you hear it with everything.
Joel Green, thank you so much for coming on the Dr. Tina Show. I am a huge fan of yours. I have been stalking you on Instagram and I grabbed your book, The Immunity Code. I know that you're the author of that and you've got your new book out, and I had to get you on the show. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah. So introduce yourself for the audience, because you've got a really interesting background.
I am a male. And
in space.
That's right. Yeah. I'm coming to you here from orbit. Meanwhile, back on Earth. Yeah.
For those watching on YouTube, you will see the space background.
I know. Yes. The wonder of green screens. Yeah, thank you. So I basically am a lifelong just fitness nerd, starting about when I was 5 with Jack LaLanne, and just my whole life with fitness was kind of part of my life. And then I was just an early adopter for a lot of stuff, and I wound up I was an athlete. I did track and field, and I along the way just kind of was a bodybuilding nerd, from the very beginning, like following Frank Zane from, the 70s and blah, blah, blah. And so I was just kind of an early adopter of a lot of things, going all the way back, some buzzwords to drop here. Like in the 80s, it was hot stuff, and it was cybergenics and Metzner's, stuff like heavy duty. In the 90s, it was, the Zone and Metrex and
the Zone. Yes.
Yeah. And then, gosh, late 90s, it was the Body for Life challenges. And then it was kind of everything whole, fresh, raw, and, all that. And so but my life was really spent mostly just as a consumer in the real world. So what happened to me was I had a period in the early 2000s where I got laid off from my .com job, and I started this just making websites for fitness stars, like really big fitness stars started making their websites. And so I had time to work out, and I'd been on this foray over the previous 10 years, just kind of getting ripped and then getting out of it and getting into the dietology of like seeing firsthand, like a lot of the stuff that really works up front, like it's kind of kicking me in the rear, like later on down the line, like just getting into out of control eating from strict dieting and stuff like that. And long story short, I wound up going into the tech industry like 2003. And so a little dirty secret of today's health industry is a lot of the same people we were all in this really small circle, kind of all knew each other. And then we wound up here. And so I wound up running this tech company, and it was a startup. So I got fat. I was working 14-hour days. I got fat. And literally just, it was kind of the same story you hear a lot of people talk about, where I had no time to work out. Like the schedule was just, getting to work, at work, meetings, pressure, and just the life a lot of people experience, where I would say the vast majority of advice that you get from quote unquote fitness will not translate into that. And a running joke I've had for a long time is, let's take all the influencers and do a reality show where they have to go get real jobs.
Yeah, right.
And then you film them. So you see what they're taking, and all that. And so anyways, I came out of that. I was fat. And I was kind of like, I was really like in this place of, wow, I just spent 30 years doing all the stuff Arnold and Frank and all these guys told me to do, and I'm fat. Like this was 2006, and it was, I just really spent some time kind of thinking through what could have been different. And out of that came this emphasis on longevity and understanding how to use food. And it took me into this place of, I really wanted to help people. And I quickly found no one really cared. People just wanted to I just want to lose 10 pounds. I don't care about all your other stuff. So I created this software back in 2007. Took a couple of years to create it, and launched it in 2008, 2009, and got kind of lucky. It was basically a nutrition software. And I took all this research that I had just been inundated with, put it into that, and the gut biome came out of that. I've been tinkering with the microbiome since 2007. In fact, I wrote the very first article on using the microbiome for weight loss back in 2007. I published that.
Wow.
And
that's OG.
Yeah. And then, so the system I created, the software was actually based on a lot of this stuff. And there was an article published in 2009 called Dietary or Gut Communities Are Rapidly Modifiable by Cruciferous Vegetables. And I kind of took all that, put it in the system. And then we went and did corporate wellness for a number of years. And so the advantage I was just doing these big engagements, like thousands of people, cities, really big companies that were coming through my corporate wellness system using this software. And I was able to just kind of harvest massive amounts of data and get tons and tons of results, literally in the tens of thousands of results with people, and kind of figure out what worked, what didn't work, and congealed all that. During that period, it was just a lot of ups and downs, going broke, making money, going broke, figuring out what I didn't know.
The entrepreneur's life, right?
Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah. Especially, and note to you, anybody that ever wants to do a software, not unless you have 20 million bucks.
I hear that. I hear that. Don't even try to launch an app without.
No. Just and get 20 million bucks, because you're two engineers, two high-end engineers now are going to cost you $500,000 to $1 million a year for two people.
Wow.
And you're not going to get anywhere with that. You're going to need more. So, but anyways, all this led to, I did some consulting with Quest Nutrition at the time, and they were kind of on their peak rise. And the founder of Quest, Ron, the real founder of Quest, Ron Penna, he created kind of a round table of, just brought a bunch of smart people together. And this was about 2015, 2016, I decided to write what became the Immunity Code. That took 3 years. I wrote that. And then I went on Ben Greenfield's podcast, and it kind of just exploded. And basically, in the jet wash of that, a lot of the protocols that were introduced in that book just became mainstream. So there was no mouth taping prior to that book. Like, the Immunity Code is what launched mouth taping. It's what launched, doing the whole night. It didn't exist. You can go back to Mark Bell's show on 2018 when I introduced it on his show, and then trace it from there, and that's when it spread. And the whole thing with doing cold plunging and sprints and deadlifts, that all came from the Immunity Code. All the Akkermansia, Bifidobac, that all came from the Immunity Code. So the book's been criticized for just stupid errors and stuff, but in terms of influence, it's probably one of the more influential books of the last 5-10 years. And I wasn't going to do another book because it nearly took my soul doing that one. But one thing I did notice was, like, I thought I had just solved the problem of diet in that book. And I realized in hindsight, no, people are just totally confused. And there were major problems that I hadn't addressed. And so the impetus of the new book was really two things. It was to advance diet significantly forward. And it was to end confusion, to take the confusion that exists with diet today and give people a framework where they could return to sense, their own sense or ancient sense, and you could apply sense. And that way you could not be, if you have two conflicting authority figures, you could just use your own sense to figure it out. So that was the impetus there.
Well, the Immunity Code is such a good book. I got my hands on it, and you're right. I mean, all of the things that you talk about in there have basically become the landscape of Instagram these days, and that's the problem with Instagram, is people just pick up one thing and then everybody runs with it. It's like, oh, this is the ball, the ball of the week. Let's, and it's like all the rage, but it's really it's a great book. I followed it very easily. I think that it's probably above a lot of people's heads if they're not super, I mean, the average person isn't maybe understanding some of the science, but man, it's so comprehensive, and it's fun too, because it reminds me of a textbook, to be totally honest with you. You can just open it and open it and you're like, okay, I'm just going to chew through this chapter. And then it's, you know what I mean? So I really like that, because I'm an academic and at heart, I'm a scientist. And so for me, I think, great book. And then just when I got in contact with you to try to get you on the show, you were working on the new book, The Way. And I had to cancel on you. And then we ended up, I didn't want to bug you for a minute because I was watching you launch the book, and I'm like, that's probably just a crazy time. So I'm just going to wait till he gets a hold of me again. So I'm so glad to finally have you here, because there's so many questions I want to ask you, and I'm hoping we can tie it all together so it makes sense for the audience, because sometimes I get super smart people on here and we nerd out on science, and then the audience emails me and says, I can't understand anything that you just said. So my podcast producer will tell me it's above his pay grade if we don't make this. We got to make it the 5th grade version. I want to hit on something you mentioned that you had in your own experience. I've had in my own experience, which is literally why I found you. The whole concept of that long-term low carb, high protein diet and what it
Hmm.
does to your body
Hmm.
and how it can actually
Hmm.
induce insulin resistance.
Hmm.
Can you talk
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. So what I mentioned in the new book, I hit you in the face with the notion that there are a number of absolutely unavoidable realities. An unavoidable reality is something that you will have to deal with. It's unavoidable. It's just when. And the most important of these that diets of this age are completely disconnected from. And when I say this, it sounds like, oh, you're just trying to sell your book, right? It's like, no, you've never written a book. You don't understand. There's no money in books.
Right.
No, because I've always been very concerned with what's true and things that I have found in hindsight over 50 plus years to be true. The idea is let's put truth out there. The truth is that the diets at this age are just disconnected from the reality of time. And it's easy to see, super easy to see. So when you look at and talk about like, low carb, high protein and start talking about it, the assumption is, well, it's only good. I mean, it's just only good, right? Until you ask what point in time. And if you ask that question you could ask that to a dozen smarties and they will, it's like a record skip. They're like, what did you just say? I said, at what point in time is it good? What do you mean? What do you mean? What point in time is it good? What are you trying to say? So the truth is there's very good research on long-term high protein, low carb diets that they actually induce insulin resistance. And there's a number of mechanisms that have been established that show why this is true. But what I do in the book, just to make it super easy to understand, is I call this the four, physics has the four fundamental forces. There kind of really are four basic forces that work over time. And it's easy to see. Again, you don't need an expert. You just need sense. So there's accumulation. Over time, if you're doing any given protocol, doesn't matter what it is, something will accumulate somewhere. Okay. There is degradation. Means if you do too much of something for too long, something somewhere is going to degrade over time. Okay. There is attenuation. If you do something for a long time, all of the different mechanisms that surround that mechanism are going to attenuate. Right. In other words, like receptors attenuate over time. Neurons attenuate over time. This is really easy.
The payoff gets less and less.
Yeah. And so we can just go, and then there's compensation. Compensation is the final of the four. So whenever you throw something at the body, there's a compensatory effect. There's a compensation that takes place. And so we could use dozens of examples here to show this is true. The example I use in the book is excessive high protein, excessive fasting long-term. Let's apply those ideas. Let's apply accumulation, degradation, compensation, and just see what happens. So what you're going to get is long-term, you're going to get a compensation in the colon. The colon's going to alkalize from excessive protein. Okay. That's not good. I know we've been brainwashed to think that alkalinity is good, acidity is bad, but it's compartment specific. So when we're talking about the colon needs to be slightly acidic. And the result of the colon going alkaline, even just a bit, is catastrophic. It's catastrophic because it becomes a cancer promoting environment when the colon gets alkaline. Okay. So that is an example of a compensation that happens when you do something too long. In this case, high protein. You're doing it way too, and by the way, it's worth mentioning that the research tends to define high protein as 25 to 35% of diet. What we're seeing nowadays is like 70, 80% of diet protein. We're seeing these incredibly high protein levels sustained over time. Another example is degradation. Okay, so let's take that. So the average person, by the time they are 60, and again, you don't need an expert, you just need sense to figure this out, has about 70% of their kidney function left. And you're losing 1% per year, even if you're healthy. So you hear this chatter online like high protein intakes are just no risk whatsoever unless you have kidney issues. Who doesn't? Okay. The organs don't work as well as you get older. That's an unavoidable reality. And so when they're not a set of tires with unlimited tread, they wear out. And so if you're shoving these massive high protein intakes in on a regular basis, there's a degradation that takes place in the kidneys. Okay. And we can go down this list and I can show you step by step. Another would be accumulation. So if we take Fusobacteria, which is a cancer promoting bacteria, and it ferments meat. Now, the really interesting thing is in dogs, Fusobacteria fermentation makes them super healthy. And it's one of the ways you can reverse engineer what you can reverse engineer what you should eat just by what you get in terms of bacteria. So dogs are pure meat eaters. My friend Ron Penna has this ranch in Texas where he's curing cancer in dogs, and they feed them their real diets. They feed them like, meat diets, and they get well. And they ferment Fusobacteria and they get well. In humans, Fusobacteria is a known cancer promoter, and you get it from fermenting protein in the colon. So about 10 to 15 grams of protein will pass through the small intestine to reach the colon every day, and it ferments. And what does it ferment? It ferments Fusobacteria. Now, in a balanced diet, that's not a big deal. In fact, there's research on this that's shown that if you have balance in the diet, you have things like inulins and fermenting fibers in the gut, it actually shifts the locus of fermentation in the gut away from Fusobacteria, and you neutralize the negative effects. And we'll get into this later. It's how diversity protects you. But basically, if you just have just meat and that's all you're eating, you're getting an accumulation of Fusobacteria in the gut. And then at the same time, you're losing the commensal bacteria. So you're losing bifidobacteria. You're losing all of these commensal bacteria that we need. And so all that to say, time matters. Time is inescapable. And that the same diet that works incredibly well at one point in time can be detrimental at another point in time. And the variable is time. And once you get your arms around this, it changes the entire landscape, because all of a sudden the question is, at what point in time becomes the most important question. And you hear it with everything. Oh, is fasting good? At what point in time? What do you mean?
Right.
What's always good? At what point?
It's so challenging too, because people on social media want things to be so black and white, and they want them to be so polarizing, and they want them to be so clear. And I have often, my response to most people is, it depends. I mean, it depends on the person sitting in front of me that I've run labs on, that I'm working with. Right. And I can't make a blanket statement about nutrition online. And whenever I've leaned, I only share what I eat. So I don't tell people how to eat. I just tell them what I eat. And whenever I've shared that, people get so hostile because they want it to be this way or that way. And it's like, yo, we're animals. We're fancy mammals with opposable thumbs. We're different ages. We have different, like you said, organ function. We are going, another thing I believe that's inevitable is we will become more insulin resistant as we age, just by the fact of how our muscles are atrophying and sarcopenia is working, and we're working against that constantly. And that's the hard part. It's like, how old is this person? What are their other concomitant risk factors? Also, the kidney thing you mentioned, most folks who have insulin resistance, which is like the bulk of Americans at this point, they have some kidney issues. So they're already rocking kidney issues. So it's like, that's a hard thing to answer folks on Instagram, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I get it. It actually segues into a really good topic, which is insulin. And
yeah, let's talk about insulin.
The insulin family of hormones. So this again is one of these things that you don't need an expert here. You just need a little bit of info and sense to figure this out. But basically, it's when you look at insulin and how insulin works, and you look at insulin over time, and you look at age, what you come up with is insulin is not working by itself. It is actually working in a family of hormones. And specifically, like when you go through and you look at the family of insulin hormones, you have GLP-1, you have GIP, you have glucagon, you have adiponectin, you have insulin, and then all of that rests on the foundation of the microbiome, meaning that interactions between the taxa in the gut and the taxa interacting with things like bile acids and other things directly affects the hormones that affect insulin and a number of other things. So that's the insulin picture. It isn't just insulin, it's the specific phenotype, or rather the enterotype of bacteria in the gut, and then it's these other hormones. So a really interesting discussion is adiponectin. So there's no diet today, none, that account for adiponectin, especially over time. And what's very interesting is when you look at adiponectin, every disease that you can think of that is age-related is associated to low adiponectin. And one of the reasons is that, so adiponectin is an adipokine, and it's a hormone secreted by body fat. It does a number of things. One of the most important things it does is it makes insulin work a heck of a lot better. It makes insulin sensitive. And so this is one of the reasons that it's kind of a rich get richer, poor get poorer. When people get really lean and they get lean, well, they're making more adiponectin, and then their insulin sensitivity is better, and then everything's easier. They can eat more. Conversely, as you get older, you start to accumulate fat. You accumulate the wrong kinds of fat in the wrong places, and adiponectin secretion decreases. And so what you see with adiponectin and age is these one-to-one correlations between lowering adiponectin, increases in visceral fat, increases in insulin resistance, increases in Alzheimer's, and most importantly, decrease in the ability to handle saturated fats.
Yes. Yeah. Talk about that too.
Yeah, so saturated fats is, one of these topics that is just infinitely confusing, and I talk about it quite a bit in the new book because it's part of what I would call a must-have mechanism. So one of the things you see a lot with age is that you just hear like, I just can't lose weight anymore. It doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter how I calorie count. I can't lose weight. Okay. And what you're seeing, what the new generation of drugs, the GLP-1 agonists, are making clearly abundantly evident is that, yeah, you're insulin resistant. And as soon as you get insulin sensitive, boom, the ocean parts and the cloud, I'm losing weight. Yay. But along with that, there is another set of mechanisms that really explain a lot, and they are woefully underrepresented. And once you get this, it changes diet completely. And it has to do with changes in the vasculature over time. So the vasculature has one major job, and that is to get glucose and oxygen into cells. Okay. Life depends on glucose and oxygen going into cells. If either one of those two things goes to zero at any given time, you're dead immediately. So what happens over time with the vasculature is there are a couple really, really critical mechanisms that kind of are like the tread on the tire or the shock absorbers on the car. They just get worn out. One of them is the NOx enzymes. Okay. And these are a family of enzymes. And what's interesting about these enzymes is they line the vasculature. They line what's called the endothelium. What's interesting about these enzymes is they are the only enzymes in the entire body that we know of that are pro-oxidative in their nature, meaning that their job is to make free radicals. There's no other enzyme we know of that does that. Now, the reasons for that have a lot to do with getting glucose into cells. Basically, without going into a lot of techie stuff, they act as a dimmer switch on glucose transport and insulin sensitivity. So when we take in glucose by its nature is inflammatory, and the NOx enzymes make free radicals, so that dilates the vasculature, and that's all good. That's great. What happens is we get older is the accelerator gets stuck. The cruise control gets stuck. And so they begin putting out free radicals into the vasculature way above the ability of things like insulin to deal with. And at the same time, so insulin by its nature is anti-inflammatory. Insulin normally quenches, there's a balance between nitric oxide and then insulin, and all this works together to make the vasculature work. So as we get older, we begin to make less nitric oxide, and the nitric oxide that we do make is less bioavailable. Mm-hmm. So one of the problems we get into is that when you do make nitric oxide as you're older, you have these free radicals now just spitting, you have these enzymes spitting free radicals out into the vasculature. And that is catastrophic for the vasculature, because what happens is essentially the vasculature begins to get inflamed. So imagine, the mechanism tasked with getting glucose and oxygen everywhere in the body is inflamed itself. So the whole body's going to be inflamed now when that happens. Yeah. This works in conjunction with another mechanism called the glycocalyx. Mm-hmm. So the glycocalyx, basically, the easy way to understand it is it's fur that lines the vasculature. It's like fur that just pops in the vasculature. The job of the glycocalyx is that it's a mechanical sensor. It's a tension sensor. And so we've all heard of leaky gut. We've all heard of that. Like, that's not bad. That's bad. You don't want to have that. Well, you can have leaky vessels. You can have leaky vasculature. And in the same way that the gut junctions can open up and let bad things in, the vascular junctions can open up and let bad things out. So what happens is immune cells will pop out, and we change names. When they're inside the vasculature, we use one name. We call them macrophages. When they pop out, or we call them monocytes. Mm-hmm. When they pop out, we call them macrophages. But the bottom line is they adhere to the external of the vasculature, and a bunch of different things happen. But long story short, that is one of the drivers of vascular disease. You start to see essentially what amount to zits inside of the vasculature, more or less. That's really what they are.
That's a good way to put it.
It's due to the decline of, when you see, one of the things that's just way underaccounted for is the hyperexpression of the NOx enzymes together with the decline of the glycocalyx, and it completely changes the way the body reacts to things. So you can take the exact same person at age 25, age 35, who has no issues with the glycocalyx, no issues with the NOx enzymes. They can eat saturated fats till the cows come home. Never going to be a problem. Take that same person and you induce NOx overexpression and glycocalyx destruction, and saturated fats now become this lethal mechanism. Same person, just different points in time. Yeah. And so it changes the equation of, are saturated fats good? And then we bring in our answer at what point in time?
At time. Yeah. What point in time? Yeah. That's that. Because this is exactly what was happening to me. I was dealing with some severe gastrointestinal issues. I had a terrible parasite I picked up in Mexico, and I've always had gut issues, but things were getting really bad. So I went back to my age-old diet that I'd put patients on whenever they were in a flare, which was high beef, high coconut oil, like all the saturated fat, and blueberries. I call it the beef and blueberry diet. And it's a great reset, but it's not something that I would encourage people to stay on forever. And I stayed on it too long. And next thing I know, and I mean, I'm hitting that like 49-year-old point, 48, 49, and the wheels just start falling off sideways. And I was like, something is wrong. And I kept telling everyone, like, something is wrong. And my psoriatic arthritis flared and everything was going sideways. And I was like, okay, so the carnivore diet calmed down the immune system there and got the gut improvement. I had to also do, some parasitic cleansing, and I got the psoriatic arthritis to calm down when I got the gut cleaned up. That was fueling that fire. But I could not wrap my head around. I have always been thin, and I've always been able to just focus on that. Like, it's not once I make the decision to lose 5-10 pounds, it just falls right off. And it's never been a challenge for me. And sometimes I'll bump up a little bit in weight, but it's, next thing I know, the harder I'm trying, I'm 20 pounds heavier, and I'm like, something is wrong. I felt like a switch had been blown in my brain. That's all I could describe it as. It was like the middle age, menopausal. And I'm not menopausal yet. I still cycle regularly, but something had blown in my brain. And I started studying GLP-1 agonists, and I was like, I think that is going to reset the switch. I have whatever this is, whatever this like switch that needs to happen. And I started microdosing them as an experiment, and it was like the sea parted, and it's just the tiniest little dose. It's the tiniest, it's like a fifth of the starting dose that most people get put on. And it's been miraculous. And suddenly, because what I had done was reintroduce carbohydrates into my diet. And that's when the 20 pounds ballooned. I'm like, oh shit, I am that person. I am the person who was too low carb for too long. And now I am dealing with it in menopause. And this is a nightmare. And I know how this goes for my family. They all turn into round little diabetic butterballs. And I was not having it. And I mean, if I even like looked at honey, I would blow up. I was like, something is wrong with this. Is not my metabolism. This is my mom's metabolism. This is not me. And GLP-1 agonists have been such a godsend, being able to cycle those as needed and get that back under control and be able to eat those carbohydrates so that I can have the fuel in the gut that I need, and the fiber and the things that I had been avoiding because I was trying to keep myself lean. And anyway, over many decades, I think I induced a bit of a mess in my body. So, and that's honestly when I found you, and you were speaking truths and answers I hadn't heard anyone talk about. And I heard you say something on one of your reels on Instagram. You were like, there is no diet to account for adiponectin and some of these other things. And I was like, damn, he's right. This is mind blowing. And like, it's not a doctor saying this, right? It's just like a guy who's been a smart dude who's been studying this for decades. I'm going that way. So anyway, that's my rant. That's my little personal saga. But anyway, so you talk about adiponectin, and you talk about also, I want to touch on this, the rebound of fat loss. Let's talk about that too, because that's another thing that I think I definitely did to myself. It's like you lose too much weight. What are the molecules that are upregulated during that process that actually add to the weight regain that you talk about in your books?
Yeah. So this is one of those topics that we are at the very beginning of, like the birthing of a new idea that will absolutely 100% transform what we've been baked into, because it's truth. It's just truth. And everybody over time will find that out for themselves. It's just a question of when. And it really has to do with high level. If you just use sense, again, you don't need to be an expert, just use sense. Our bodies are designed to protect us from dying. Okay. And throughout most of human history, there were no refrigerators and food was often scarce. And so the result of that, in fact, in the new book, I talk about this. There's basically 4 rhythms you'll find in nature. There is famine. Famine is you just can't find anything. Famines have been common throughout history. They just are. So if our bodies didn't adapt to periodic famines, there'd be no human race. We wouldn't be here talking about it. And so what happens is, long story short, it's a simple concept, is that every time there's a famine, the body learns and gets better at not dying. That's the simple way to understand it. It gets better at putting the weight back that you lost and protecting you from the next famine. Okay. And it learns rapidly from this. And there's all these, it's really fascinating when you study it. Like there's all these mechanisms. It isn't 1, it isn't 2, it isn't 10. It's like 20, 30 mechanisms, any one of which you could explain, any one of which would be a career for an influencer online. No, I know why you can't lose weight. It's this one mechanism. And it would be 100% true. And it would be one of like 30 other truths that are 100% true. So noteworthy though, kind of in that, but just let me give the big picture here, which is what most people are going to experience over time is they're going to see, somebody get some great result doing something. The latest is, Dana White went to Gary Brecka and got the, and so everybody's like, oh, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Right.
And he's just doing keto diets. That's what he's doing. And water fasts and simple stuff. Okay.
It was actually a bone broth fast. He's like, I water fasted, but I drank bone broth. I'm like, that's
water
not
fast,
water
bone
fast
broth, water fast, bone broth, TRT, keto. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
No special.
It's a methylation. Like get your methylation in check, right?
Yeah, take some B vitamins, whatever. So, but what you don't see, what you're not thinking about, is what that picture is going to look like in 5 or 10 years, because. And this is now, it's documented if anybody makes it a point to go look up the mechanisms, the rebound effect, you're going to find science paper to science paper talking about this, that essentially there is a unique phase, a period of time post fat loss where the body is trying to fix the problem, and genes are activating, proteins are activating, neurons are reconfiguring, all kinds of things are happening towards one goal, which is to regain the lost weight. Now, you don't see that typically in the fitness ecosystem because there's a counter mechanism, which is because you're paid to get fit, you just keep working out all the time, and all your time goes to working out. So you don't see the rebound effect. But in the real life world, that's all you see is the rebound effect. Okay. And basically, there's a lot of new research on this. One of the most notable mechanisms is what's called synaptic amplification. Synaptic amplification. What that means is there are synapses in the brain. Synapses is a gap between a neuron. And specifically as it concerns food intake, we have 2 sets of neurons that kind of are in the picture of GLP-1 and why they work. And it's the kind of, let's call them the good neurons, is the POMC neurons, propiomelanocortin system. It's part of the melanocortin system. And basically, these neurons kind of suppress food intake, and they are activated by the GLP-1 receptors in the gut. So when you have food come in, they activate GLP-1, GIP, and then it turns on the receptors in the brain that tell you to eat less. The opposing group of neurons is called agouti-related protein. And these are a set of neurons that make you eat more. And long story short, what is now documented, proven, like established, is a smoking gun mechanism post-fat loss. And again, it's one of 30. But essentially what a group of scientists out of Harvard were able to show in 2023 is that the number of synapses in the brain in the agouti-related complex tripled post-fat loss. Wow. So imagine a country road and you got a 1-lane highway and only one car at a time can go down on the highway. And then all of a sudden 2 other lanes appear. And now you have basically a highway. You have a synaptic superhighway now. And now 3 times the cars can go down that road. So post-fat loss, what has now been documented to take place is the neural inputs, the data, the push to eat is tripled. Yes. And we can see the neurons tripling in the brain. We can see like, oh yeah, you're going to eat more. I can tell you that right now. So that's one mechanism, and that's activated by calorie cutting, caloric deficits, and it's basically famine, starvation. And then that also explains why fasting works so good initially and then doesn't work at all later for a lot of
Yes.
people. And again, this goes back to what I talked about earlier. So this is compensation. So I said accumulation, degradation, compensation, attenuation. This is compensation. The compensation for the calorie cutting was to triple the neurons in the brain telling you to eat. Whoa, whoa. Now, we could just leave it at that, and that would be kind of like all we'd ever need to say on the subject to, number one, prove this is a real thing. But also, it changes our entire understanding of what we think fat loss is, because we just think if I can just show the selfie, with me 20 pounds lighter, I did it. It worked.
Yeah, I figured it out.
Yeah. But the reality, and it's taken me decades to figure this out and to see it, is that's not the reality. The reality is chronic weight cycling. That's the reality for most people.
Right.
Now, on a bell curve, you're always going to see, the outer edges of the curve, someone did some diet and they kept it off. But the majority of the bell curve is going to have some degree of chronic weight cycling, meaning, a few years go by, there's a rebound effect. I kind of regained it. I'm going to try something else now. And then what it culminates in by about the time you're 50 is it's very difficult to lose weight. It's very difficult, very difficult. And that now touches into a bunch of other mechanisms, a bunch of other things that are kicking in now. Now that gets into physical, mechanical issues with fat cells that, it's kind of like you played that accordion one too many times and
right.
It's not cooperating now, and a bunch of other things. But all that to say, there is a very real compensatory effect for fat loss, and it changes the entire dynamic of what we have thought of in terms of, well, how do we get where we want to go? Because the most important thing, it's very hard to lose fat, very, very hard, especially at certain points in time, but even harder is to beat the rebound. And so the rebound effect is really the thing that needs the focus and the attention to beat that rebound, because if you don't compensate for the rebound, the highest probability is that within 5 years you'll regain all the weight, and then it gets harder and harder and harder and harder. So,
and the success rate of weight loss retention is so minuscule. It's on par with addicts having success with rehab. It's like 2 to 5% of people actually might keep that weight off. And that's the part where I had a lot of patients I had to get weight off of, because I was doing regenerative injections on their joints. I specialize in musculoskeletal conditions, and we had to get weight off people for the sake of their joints. And if I had had a tool like a GLP-1 agonist at that time, it would have just been a godsend and a miracle. And I'm so tired of these fitness influencers and these health influencers, these purists who are like, oh, they just need to eat less and move more. I'm like, are you effing kidding me? I'm so sick of hearing that. I'm like, I basically want to be like, show me you have no idea how weight loss works in the brain or anywhere else in the body by, without actually saying it, because it's so ignorant and it's so short-sighted. And I've been very sorely disappointed with some people that I really, respect. They just jump on the GLP-1s or poison bandwagon. And I'm like, dude, the poison's in the dose. The poison's in the dose. And if you overdose anybody on a drug or a peptide, you're going to have bad reactions. But yet we're not blaming the doctor or the dose. We're blaming the peptide. It's ridiculous. Anyway.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how ghrelin and leptin fit into this rebound phenomenon and what's happening there? Is there a player there with that's why I'm guessing part of that, the fat cells, the accordion wearing out, but the signaling gets screwed up.
Yeah. Basically it's post-fat loss, ghrelin's higher, leptin's lower. And so ghrelin makes you eat more. Leptin makes you eat less, but ghrelin's acute. Leptin is long-term. So I hope I got that right. Sometimes I switch things around in my brain. I think I got that right.
No, I believe you're right. Yes. Yeah. I know. I always mix those up too. Yeah. No, yeah. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Because leptin resistance is the problem, is a big problem in fat retention.
Yeah. So long story short, so post fat loss, one of the problems that we have to overcome is the disruptions in ratios of leptin to ghrelin. And so ghrelin is that hormone that is sky high prior to eating a meal, and then you eat a meal and then ghrelin goes down. So it's acute, meaning short term. Leptin kind of works on a longer phase. It's more of like a gradual uptick in terms of how much you're eating. But suffice to say that post fat loss, those are typically disrupted. And so you have an inversion of where they should be. And so really the trick is that we want leptin to be higher. We want leptin to be, generally speaking, higher, although not in all cases. You can have people that have issues too much leptin already and they lose fat, but for most people they're going to have this issue. And then the second thing is that the increase in ghrelin, the static increase in serum ghrelin, needs to go down post fat loss, and so you have to attack that as well. And not coincidentally, what's very interesting, those two also tie into sleep quite a bit. So it's very interesting how these hunger hormones actually are sleep manipulators as well. So when we can suppress ghrelin and elevate leptin, and we can do that chronically and targeted, we can target like foods to help those hormones, then we actually sleep better, which gets to a whole other discussion of incorporating the idea of using food to drive sleep. And that's part of the equation when we get older, is people start to get sleep disrupted as they get older. And so you have this kind of wheel with a bunch of spokes on it. One of them is, well, you're not sleeping as well. And because you're not sleeping as well, you're going to sleep worse. And because you're sleeping worse, you're getting insulin resistant. And then, along with that, you're not making the glutathione you should. So the glycocalyx and the cardiovascular system's a mess. And then you're eating saturated fat. And that's a problem, inducing more insulin resistance. And you don't have adiponectin stimulate. And all these things work together as one thing. But,
and that's the disaster. That was where I was. I was like, I am in the disaster. I've got to pull out of this before it gets the best of me, because like you said, it's accumulative. And that 5 pounds you gain that you don't get off, because as it becomes more difficult, like I said, I used to just think about weight loss and I'd be like, oh, that 5-10 pounds will come right off. All of a sudden it's like, I know how this is going to look at 55 and at 60 and at 65. And this is not going to be pretty if I don't get on top of this. And I feel my heart goes out to these women who enter into their 40s already in that hot mess. And it's just so hard. It's like, this is so hard to turn around, and it's going to be so much harder at 50. This is why I preach muscle and, packing on as much as you can while you still can. And it's so weird. People will come to me. I just got a message from a gal yesterday. And it was such a nice message. I've lost 60 pounds and it's all because of you and everything you've taught me. And she just started strength training at the end of the 60-pound weight loss journey. And I was like, oh, if you had only been strength training from the onset and been accumulating muscle throughout this process, things would be much better. But
whenever I hear, people with a lot of influence putting out those platitudes like eat less, move more, and all that stuff, I know they've never dealt with real populations of people. Like I know that, like, you've never dealt with people in the real world in significant numbers, because what you find when you do is that you can do the most precise calorie controlled diet in the world and won't put a dent in it. And it won't put, in fact, very often they gain weight on subcaloric diets, and that's a statement that a lot of experts would be like, prove it. And no, you can't. There's no proof that you can gain weight on subcaloric diets. I'm just saying I've seen it enough times, but minimally what I've seen is that you apply like kind of the calorie cutting approach, and it does not work. And it's because all these other mechanisms are, like insulin resistance, are kicking in. And so these GLP drugs are a wonder, because, and I've had people accuse me of shilling for pharma because,
me too,
but it's because I've just seen people where nothing works so many times that these things properly utilized are a wonder, because number one, they allow you to, if it's possible to get weight off without them, then use them at the rebound, them at the rebound point. And that's you'll kick the rebound that way. Or sometimes you just have people that just cannot drop body fat, and that's the uptick in insulin sensitivity from those things is the thing that was needed. So, it's used strategically, they can be a very good thing. I mean, they're probably, again, attenuation. You get 5 years in, the drug's probably not going to work anymore, but the goal should be to get you off them. So that's a combo.
Or cycle them. Yeah. Like any other peptide or hormone, you cycle it. Yeah. And one of many tools. There's other tools, there's other peptides, there's other things we can do. And I think it's just, I firmly believe that the way they are being used more commercially is they are starting the dose too high. They're cranking the dose too high for too long, and they're blowing out people's metabolism that way on the other end, and they're really, I think there's going to be some serious receptor downregulation. And I do believe that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. There's a set point, right? Like I got to my set point. I got back to my weight, my normal like fighting weight. Like Dr. Tina's fighting weight is 135. That's where I am strong, I'm healthy, I'm thin, I fit in all my clothes, everything's good. And it brought me back down there and I can't budge below it. Now, if I want to crank the dose up and start getting side effects, I can definitely get below that, but I know I'll rebound back to that. That's like my set point. And so I think that I'm experimenting with myself and some patients. I think the microdosing and keeping the dose as low as possible, cycling it, getting off of it, allowing the refeed period, seeing how the body responds. Like that's a big piece of this that I think allopathic medicine's missing, but they miss a lot of things. So you mentioned sleep and you got me. I was already a super fan. And then you made a reel about grilled cheese sandwiches at night. And I was like, I love this man's brain because I've been doing that for a long time and I didn't actually know why it was working. But can you talk about the grilled cheese at night or the mac and cheese that's in your new book? Because I was
Yeah.
like, this is so good.
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing to preface the convo with is that if we accept the premise that food is the foundation of health, then the question that comes from that is, well, then, okay, how should we eat? And then how should we eat leads us into looking at, well, what are the pillars of health? And you have to factor in sleep. You have to, like, you can't leave that out of the equation. And you have to factor in the fact that food impacts sleep. And this is like, it's not there. When you look at the diet landscape today, you look at carnivore, you look at keto, you look at, low carb, high carb, it doesn't matter. There's no tactical implement of food specifically to drive sleep. It doesn't exist. Okay. And that, when you think about it, it's ridiculous because when you look at the research on this, what immediately pops up is that the hunger hormones and the feeding hormones directly impact REM sleep. They directly impact sleep quality. They impact sleep fragmentation. Meal patterns and sequences of eating directly impact sleep. I mean, I don't do a lot of coaching anymore, but I have clients that I've worked with who we just cannot not give them breakfast, because what we do when we give them breakfast is, particularly a high carb breakfast, is their sleep onset is much earlier and they sleep much better later at night. And so it just gets to the body's sleep clocking mechanisms they're not just diurnal, they're not just driven by light and dark, they're driven by feeding cycles. You can prove this in 2 seconds by looking at hamsters and mice and all that, or look at babies. When you feed a baby, the first thing they do is go to sleep. So there's been this overemphasis on light and dark cycles, and I might be partially responsible for that because in 2016, when I was writing the immunity code, nobody was talking about that, and I put that in there. But one of the things I did try to put in the first book was that an equal way out with food drives sleep too. Food's very important. And so when you look at the foods that promote sleep onset, carbohydrates are very much in the picture. And it's a very interesting thing when you look at people with problems like weight problems. Typically, you'll find in the real world that they have very stressful lives, stressful jobs. And so they come home and they are giving themselves a natural cortisol and natural sleep remedy, which is typically alcohol and carbs. They'll do wine and they'll do carbs, and that takes the stress out. And it does help them wind down, does get cortisol down, does help them get to sleep. Not the best thing long term, but
Right.
you can take that same notion and just apply it strategically, which is, okay, carbs, particularly certain types of carbs combined with other types of foods, they are very, very useful at helping us to get to sleep. And what's recently kind of there have been compounds that are involved in this, that, peptides that we can now look at that are in certain types of carbs. Dairy, for example, dairy has carbs, or they actually drive sleep onset, and they do this apart from the action on the large neutral amino acids. So apart from the action on, serotonin and, driving all this stuff, they also have peptides that drive sleep. So all that to say, meal patterns, the sequences, and the types of foods can have a big impact on sleep. And some of the easy ones are periodic, very large meals at breakfast with a lot of carbohydrates and a decent amount of protein. That's going to advance the sleep clock. It's going to make you want to sleep earlier at night, and you're going to sleep better, because what you're doing is elevated ghrelin in the serum is going to disrupt sleep. So what ghrelin does is it increases one type of sleep at the expense of another. So you get less REM sleep, more non-REM sleep, but you get more sleep fragmentation when ghrelin's high. It's super easy to prove because ghrelin's a hunger hormone. So try being starving in sleep. It's hard.
Oh,
And
it's
that's
no good.
yeah, that's one of the reasons that fasting for extended periods begins to have an impact on sleep. And that's one of the failings of the influencer community, which is, you have a bunch of people who never fasted, jumping on the fasting bandwagon, going, it's the cure all, it's the answer, it's everything. Well, they never factored in sleep. and they never factored in ghrelin. They never factored in
Yeah.
how these things play out. So all that to say, these hunger hormones, when we get them down, we're going to sleep better. And again, you don't need an expert. This is sense. Like go eat a 3,000 calorie meal and try and stay awake. Watch what happens. You're going to go right out.
Good luck.
You go right out. So one of the things in my first book was a hack that I've been using in my nutrition system going back into the 2000s. And that was a grilled cheese sandwich at night with sourdough and cheese and all that. And essentially what you get out of that is you get these really cool sleep peptides in cheese and dairy, and then you get stimulation of the right amino acids. And so that combined with an insulin pulse, there's good research showing that like kind of a small insulin centric meal at bedtime is going to help sleep. So those things together, they work to drive sleep onset. And then in the new book, I kind of took it a step further with a recipe where we added in nutmeg. And so nutmeg has myristicin, which is kind of a psychedelic. And if you get too much of it, it's not good. But just in, dietary amounts in a meal, it helps sleep onset. And then you combine that with dairy, it really helps sleep. And so that combined with carbs, mac and cheese, and all that, it just helps sleep. And we can tweak it by the meal patterns that we use. So basically what I show in the new book is you just engineer around it. So you have the carbs at night, and the following morning is a strategic short fast. So we're offsetting kind of any weight gain from that. And then earlier in the day, we're having these insulin sensitizing meals leading up. And then you have an insulin sensitizing preload meal prior to that mac and cheese. So we're doing kind of all the GLP-1 actions without the drugs. That's not to say that food can ever mimic drugs. It can't. The GLP that you're going to get from food doesn't work the same as the drugs. The drugs, it's a GLP synthetic that lasts much longer, just works better. But we can combine both. We can learn different ways of staggering and sequencing foods to drive parameters like sleep, immunity, and all these other cool things.
Yes, that's what I loved about your book, and both your books and your Instagram, is you talk about staggering your meals strategically on certain days and doing things specifically. You even talked about at one point, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were talking about getting the actual size of the bolus of food to hit for specific reasons. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, it's a very important thing. So, physical dimension in the body is a programmatic thing. And I'm talking pointy head language, but I just mean that body is so ingenious in the way it works. One of the signal mechanisms in the body is when stuff gets poked out, like distended or, physicality, it programs things. And so it's very important periodically to have like a thick bolus just pass through the digestive tract, something kind of big and thick. And because it affects a lot of things, it affects very specific hormones related to feeding. So all of those hormones like cholecystokinin and NPYY and ghrelin, all those hormones are affected by it. But also it can act as a brush in a lot of ways. So as it's going through the digestive tract, if you have the right foods in there, those foods are making contact in 360 degrees as they go through the gut. And that's why supplements can't mimic foods, because you can take a supplement, but it doesn't have the physical properties of a food. So it's just an important thing to do periodically for a number of different reasons. Sleep onset is one of them. So having a really big breakfast in the morning. It's also a really good way to offset weight gain from dropping fat. And what it gets us into, though, the bigger topic is that something I talk about in the new book is that if you just think about this for a minute, it will make so much sense, and it will transform how you think about food. And it's basically this, it's that everybody gets that nature naturally optimizes, like kind of that's a no-brainer, like being in nature, aligning the body with light and dark, it optimizes. Getting your feet in the dirt kind of optimizes, being near the ocean or in the forest, forest bathing, it optimizes. So that's an easy thing to get. Once you accept that as a premise, and it's not too hard to prove, the next level of that is that nature has a meal plan in and of itself, and it's super easy to replicate, super easy to prove. And it basically is this, it's that famine and foraging go together, and then that's followed by feasting. And you don't need any expert to tell you this, you just need to go take a survival course. what's going to happen is they'll teach you some stuff, spend a day teaching you, and then they set you loose. And first thing you know, you're foraging and you're going hungry while you're foraging, because the
Yeah.
things you're foraging for aren't things I would pick per se. They're not my first pick. I mean, they're the last resort. The Hadza has a word for that. They have a word for the foods of last resort, which is the roots. They'll eat the roots, but they prefer like the honey if they can find it, or they prefer the
Sure.
meat if they can get it. But so in the process of trying to get the foods of higher preference, the feast, that wow, we landed a salmon, or we got a water buffalo, we got something substantial. You're eating mushrooms, you're eating roots, you're eating the odd berry that you find, you're eating greens, whatever, just whatever. It's not preferential foods. The interesting thing though is that that's always gone together all throughout history. Famine or famine with foraging. In other words, not eating, being hungry, and foraging, they go together. And what's really interesting, I think I make a pretty good case for this in the new book. I hope I did. It's that they are actually highly synergistic, and they optimize, and they are part of nature's plan to offset the detrimental effects of opposing food groups. So we live in this era where everybody's siloed up into the meat tribe and the vegan tribe and the oxalate tribe, and don't eat those foods, those are the bad ones, we got the good ones, you eat our food, that's the key, our foods are the
Yeah.
way, right? Well, here's the thing that they have all of them missed completely, and we're going to prove this in just a second. It's really funny. The opposing foods, the foods you're demonizing, those are the foods that actually protect you from the toxic effects of the foods that you're advocating. And that's nature's
Yes.
meal plan. So nature is set up in such a way where you can't get too much of anything, and that's the way it was for who knows how many thousands of years. It's with no refrigerators, it's hard to get too much of anything. So
Right.
you're going to have famine with foraging. You're going to have a feasting. You can have feasting in the middle of a famine. You just got lucky and got something, but there isn't much. And then you have a season of abundance. Season of abundance is, whatever, we caught like a herd and we're going to make beef jerky and eat good for 3 months. But then you're back to the, famine, feasting, foraging. Well, what you find is that there's an interesting synergy between all of those foods in that pattern. And it's a sequence. It's a natural sequence. It's, set me loose on my survival course. First thing, couldn't get, trying to get some fish, nothing going. I'm going to dig up some roots, and I found some mushrooms, and I'm eating these foods. Those foods stimulate the commensal bacteria in the gut that amplify all of the longevity pathways that happen in foraging rather in famine. So there is a natural synergy between going hungry and foods of lesser preference you find when foraging. They work together to extend lifespan.
Yeah.
And then the really interesting thing, and this is so fascinating once you begin to look at like the cardiovascular system and insulin, they all work together to maximize fitness and minimize toxicity. So example would be, let's go back to meat for a sec, because the meat tribe likes to vilify oxalate containing foods. Okay, spinach and green leafy veggies. Oh, we don't want to eat those. It's or roots. Like carbs. Bad. Well, it turns out that the bacteria that are spun up during the foraging famine phase are the very bacteria that protect you from the toxic bacteria like fusobacteria. So you're going to eat those foods. Like you found some berries, you found some roots, you found, the starches, the resistant starches, the phenols, they feed the commensal bacteria like bifidobacteria, like Akkermansia. And then as a result, you don't ferment the toxic metabolites from meat fermentation. So
Right.
this complete opposite reality, which is the real truth, emerges, which is these food tribes are all spun up trying to, make one food the hero and the other the villain. And it turns out that the villain they're pointing to is the one that saves you from the liabilities of
Right.
your hero. And it really, you could prove it. You could prove it going down the list for just about any food. And so it brings us to this really interesting premise. And again, I keep repeating myself here. You don't need an expert, just need sense to figure this out. The driving force behind all diet ancestrally is scarcity. Scarcity is the story of ancestral eating. All eating revolved around scarcity, and scarcity has a really interesting effect. It forces variety in the diet. Scarcity will force you to have a varied diet, to eat things you didn't prefer to eat. If you had a refrigerator standing by, I'm hitting the ribeyes up, right?
Right.
But if you don't, that bok choy is looking pretty good right about now. So, so scarcity forces variety into the diet. And then the net of variety is variety protects against toxicity. That's going to hold up. That'll hold up the scrutiny. That destroys most of the diets of this era once you really get your arms around that. Because the thing is, you can kick the tires on that and keep kicking them, and it's not going to fall apart. It's going to hold up the scrutiny.
It makes total sense. And I've cut entire food groups out of my diet before and felt terrible. And I've overindulged in entire food groups before and felt terrible. And I have realized that just going back to the way my mentor taught me to eat, which was very simple. We cook the vegetables to the point where, well, it's just old naturopathic medicine. Like, you cook things down until the gut will tolerate them well. And you deneutralize some of those toxins that those plant toxins carry that, and if you avoid a food, you avoid it for a time until you heal the gut with the intention of healing the gut, not just taking it out forever. And you bring them back, you reintroduce them as tolerated, and you reintroduce them however you must. If you must cook it to mush or steam it to mush, then you do initially until that person can tolerate those things. Like taking whole, I took FODMAPs out of my diet for a long time, and that was a disaster at the end of the day. And I've been guilty of it. And this is why I don't talk much. People really want me to talk about food and diet often. And I don't, because I'm like, I don't have, your answer is it. It's like, and like you say in your books, the timing of this matters. And so it's not as simple as like hit this every morning, 7 days a week. It's, and you've actually shown on your Instagram different foods that you're eating at that time and place, and you explain why. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, it totally makes sense, because you're just using common sense and, like you said, going back to optimal timing. So no, I get it. And then you mentioned longevity. I was watching a movie or a program called A Small Light, and it was about Anne Frank and her family. And it was such a good series. I think I want to say it's on Netflix. It was so good. But my husband mentioned, he said, a lot of the survivors of that whole time period lived for so long. And I was like, well, that's because they starved. Unfortunately, it was terrible. They've starved for a long time. And longevity it comes in food restriction at times too, right? But we can't do that forever, because then you start sloughing off the insides of your gut lining and you start living off of your own tissues. It's a mess. And so I love that idea of like foraging and famine and then feasting, and just bringing it back to that sort of primal set. I think we had that, back, you're old enough to remember this, like the whole paleo movement, right? Like the paleo movement though, and nutrition, right? When the paleo diet came out and all of that, Rob Wolf was actually on a program where that's the first place I saw him actually, he was like bow hunting on this program, this reality show. Do you know about this? He was on a reality show where they threw them all out there, and like people had to leave the show because they were starving to death. And Rob Wolf finally took an elk down with a bow and fed the whole group. And he was the hero. They like kept it in the creek to keep it cold. And it was and I was like, this guy's freaking awesome. And then I found out he wrote a book, and, anyway, that's when I started seeing that in the, going around. And I think I was just getting out of school then. But anyway, the paleo movement, but even they talk about rotation. There's rotation in the diet. And I think we've lost rotation in the diet. We're just now, like you said, in these tribes, these hardcore tribes. And man, they're fervent online. Why is that? It's got to be something to do with oxytocin or something. Like you question someone's dietary tribe and they lose their freaking minds. It's wild.
That's a really interesting point. I actually, in my new book, had to spend 2 full chapters on that.
Because, okay. I didn't read those chapters yet because I do not understand it.
Yeah, no, it gets to the issue of it's basically so high level, the problem in diet is confusion. That's the problem, because you don't know who to believe, and you have people on both sides, all sides, PhDs and MDs and all kinds of well-credentialed people saying totally opposite things, and so the average person is just super confused. They don't know who to believe. And when you break that problem down and go, well, what's going on here? What you quickly come to is, well, the issue is authority. That's the issue. And then when you break that problem down, what you find is that that's a problem actually that is much bigger than diet. It goes way beyond diet. That is a problem facing all of society right now. And essentially the problem is that we are in an era where thought itself is compromised because truth is compromised. We're in an era where the concept of truth is under assault. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting when you trace this back. So what's happened is, historically, people groups had a shared set of organizing principles from which they could derive sense and they could make sense of reality. Okay. And this was true of, the world pretty much until about the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And what you have now is that doesn't exist anymore. You don't have a shared common organizing framework to parse the world with. And so the result of that has been when you have no common framework, then the sense that is common to all goes with it. Okay. The sense that was once common to all, that was based on that common framework, is gone. So when you don't have common sense anymore, or the sense that it's common to all, then you have an over reliance on authority and authority figures and institutions to tell you truth, which they are more than happy to appropriate. The only problem is they have a terrible track record with truth. Like when you look at historically what happens when institutions and authority figures want to claim the high ground of truth, that never has worked out good, ever. Never has worked out good, because retaining power is antithetical to truth, okay, in a lot of ways. So what you have now effectively amounts to a number of different pathways that all end up at animal training, essentially. It's society-wide animal training, where some have called the problem we're in now a post-truth to society. Okay. And it's really astounding that could be sort of a thing, like, oh yeah, this is the post-truth society. Well, the problem with that is that truth has an ancestral imperative. When you look at truth has always been the absolute quintessential first survival principle, because truth is connected to reality. So when you lose the ability to discern what's true, you lose the ability to see what's real and true. And human populations have always put the highest value on sanity and truth, because you're dead without it. Like in a survival situation, when you disconnect from reality, you're going to be dead really, really fast. Okay. And so when you look historically, the embracing of non-reality was shunned. Like if a person embraced non-reality, they were shunned. They were out of the group, because that's a threat to the whole group. Insanity is a threat to the group. When you look at the sequence, when insanity takes place in a person or a cult or a people group or a society, death always, always follows. It's just a question of when. Okay, because the thing that keeps you alive is being able to see reality. When you can't see reality, I can think I'm a carrot. I'm not a carrot. I can believe I can levitate. Doesn't mean I can levitate. And so what we're seeing now is this society-wide disconnection from reality at the meta level. And what that's resulted in is that it's more difficult to discern what's true in all silos of knowledge. And so the net of that is that two things. Number one, you get tribes, and tribes basically roll up into authority figures. And then all that's needed is the authority figures just need to conflict. That's all that has to happen. I get it all the time. I get people I'll put something out about the gut biome detoxifies oxalates, and I'll have the oxalate tribe attack me because their authority figure said that's not true, and I'm threatening their view of reality. That's what's going on. And so, it's like I've triggered a religious cult, and they come at me, and then they call in their authority figure, and then we go rounds and all that stuff. But all that to say, the problem itself is not a problem of diets. This is a system-wide problem where what has happened is the sense that was once common to all is gone, and truth-telling is attacked. And it's funny, in diet, you can see the down trickle into this. Like, for example, if I go online, I start talking about, the reality of being overweight, that you're going to predispose, this and that and this and that, I'll get attacked for fat shaming. Okay. Or I'm weight insensitive, or I don't respect weight diversity, all this crazy stuff, and it's crazy because I'm just seeking truth, but you be attacked for telling truth. There was a study that I talk about in the new book where something fascinating, a bunch of teens were studied in the early 2000s, and they were all overweight. And 201, they could all identify, yeah, I'm overweight. I know I'm overweight. And then what happened is post 2012, same questionnaire, same set of questions were put to overweight teens, and they could not identify as overweight. Like, no, I'm not overweight. Even though no, the scale says you are, all the numbers say you are. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. And so what you're seeing is this society-wide disconnection from reality. And it is the result of abandoning what we once had in terms of shared principles to organize and make sense of the world. And you see the trickle down in diet, because the barometer for diet used to be that we all had the same We all had the same organizing principle. It was that a healthy diet was diverse, nutrient dense, included, meats, fruits, grains, nuts. That was the standard. And if you were to try to talk outside that, it'd have been ridiculous. Like, no, dude, that's not a healthy, balanced diet. Now you have the exact opposite. Now what you have is the way to get to health is through non-diversity. The way you get to health is through exclusion, is through niching down and just focusing on just these foods. Or rather, the way I put it is imbalance. The way to health is to imbalance something, which is a perfect example of disconnecting from reality. The reality is this body works on homeostasis. Yes. It is a masterwork of balance, and too much of anything, doesn't matter what it is, will disrupt that in some way, and that will create some health condition. And you can verify this for yourself, just using sense. It's like if you talk to someone about, like in the meat tribe, like, you could get too much meat. How dare you? You get that.
Yeah.
Or if you say, like, to the oxalate tribe, no, I really need green leafies in the diet. They're essential for to solve the glycocalyx and the NOx problem. How dare you? It's just, you get this hyperpolarization, tribalization, and that is the result of there have been very, very specific, some say intentional, techniques that have been directed at everybody. One of those is called axiomatic by induction, and an axiom is something that we just generally believe to be true. But we don't. How do we know that it's true? Well, we know it's true because authority figures repeat it. Well, yeah, but does that make it true? Well, of course it's true, because everybody says it's true. Okay. So when enough authority figures repeat something long enough, then it becomes induced. It becomes, just part of what you think is true. And it's, again, that's a form of animal training. It's rewarding people for thought compliance. And we live in an age it's really interesting. I talk about this in the new book. It's the promise of the age of reason was that we would level up, that the individual would level up into greater degrees of reality. And what took place, this is the biggest irony in all of history, is the exact opposite.
Yep.
The individual has leveled down into mental hegemony, mental submission.
It's wild. It's been wild to watch throughout my lifetime. And I have to sit back and laugh at it at this point. It's like every man and woman for themselves. The smart ones are going to stick together and we're going to make it.
Yeah. It's, I put it as a thing in the new book, which is that the way out of this is to return to sense. That's the way out, because there's a concept called nonage. Have you heard of that before?
Mm-mm.
So nonage is it's a word that Kant spoke about it. It refers to an inability to rely on your own sense apart from someone else. So it's a psychological dependence on somebody else to parse reality for you. Well, that's the age we're in. We're in the era of nonage, and specifically to diet, we're in the era of diet nonage. And nonage, all nonage requires is induction. That's all it requires. You just basically listen to authority figures, and things become axiomatic by induction. Sense requires deduction. Sense requires you to deduce what is true, and a lack of psychological dependence. And it requires a common framework to parse reality with. And that's the problem. And that's that problem, the inability to parse reality for what it is. But the thing about that is reality has a way of coming upon you very hard and very fast. When you look at history, basically you kind of see this, pattern of a people coming out of hardship and building something great because they've been plugged into reality through hardship. And then about 3-4 generations down, everybody's just partying and that's all they care about, and then they're just completely out of touch with reality. And then somehow reality comes in hard and fast.
Yep.
And you lose just about everybody. And the survivors of that are reconnected to reality. And it just gets back to the ancestral tenet that survival is the original biohack. And survival
yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And it relies on sense. It relies on seeing reality as it is. Yeah, no, you really don't want to cross that freeway. It's not a good idea. Bad, don't do that. Seeing reality as it is. And that's the systemic problem, is a disconnection from reality. And it's trickled down into diet in a number of ways.
Oh, I love that. I think that's the perfect place to leave this because you just summarized it all beautifully. And you're so right. You know, survival is the ultimate biohack, and that's that. I have so enjoyed talking to you, Joel. I hope you'll come back. There's so much more to your book I'm gonna read and then gonna pick your brain on it. So we would love to have you back on. Where can everybody find you? Where's the best place for them to go to get more of this? I know you're on Instagram. I'll make sure to hook that link up, but where else?
Yeah, I'm also on X now or Twitter. And I like that right now, at least because I can talk a little more freely than I can on Instagram. So I include more stuff like the last 15 minutes on there. So definitely love to get your follow me on X. I'm just starting out there. Follow me on Instagram. And then you can go to veepnutrition.com is my website. And we've got all kinds of goodies there for you. And then on my Instagram, I have a huge amount of free content. You just click on the link in my bio and you'll see what's called the Young Body Challenge. And I got everything in there. I got like my gut reset. I've got like sprinting in 90 days, all kinds of cool stuff. And it's all free. So
Yeah, no, you are a rich resource of information. And I was so glad to stumble upon your content and find you. So thank you so much for making the time to come on the show today. And I'll make sure all the links are hooked up there. And yeah, any parting thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Return to sense.
Yes, please, God.
Yes.
Let's make that our 2024 motto, right?
Yes. Our survival depends on it.
Yes. Thank you, Joel, for coming on the
Thank
show.
you.
We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.